Hello and congratulations! You've made it to the final chapter of our FSPCA curriculum on preventive controls for animal food. This is chapter 10 and is going to cover recall plans. Here are the objectives for this chapter. We're going to look at some important definitions related to recalls. We're going to look at various elements of a recall plan, what should be in a recall plan, who to notify when you do have to do a recall. We'll talk about some ways to check the effectiveness of your recalls, and we'll talk about appropriate disposition of products when you do have to go through this recall process. This does not recover all of the FDA's recall requirements, so make sure you're meeting all of those regulations that you're subject to, but I think this gives a good outline of what we're looking for under Part 507 when it comes to a recall. Keep in mind a couple of things. Number one, you do have an example food safety plan in the back of the student manual associated with this course, and it does have a template for a pretty good recall plan. Even some of it is pretty fleshed out. So take a browse at that and take a look at those different elements there. Also, I wanted to remind you that this is part of Subpart C of this regulation, so we've kind of jumped back to Subpart C. And when we first looked at Subpart C and looked at the food safety plan, I told you that recall plans are only required if you have a hazard requiring a preventive control. Okay, so if your food safety team has gone through the hazard analysis process and decided that you do not have a hazard that requires a preventive control, you are not required to have a recall plan in your food safety plan. That said, I think every inspector, anyone that works at the state level or federal level of the Department of Agriculture will ask you to please have a recall plan anyways. It's something that all of the regulators requested, but legislatively it was denied. So I'm recommending to everybody that takes my class, please have a recall plan in place for all of your products in case something does go wrong. You at least want to have those steps written down so you know what to do. Here's the actual regulation on recall plans. This is 507.38 if you're following along in your appendix with the regulation. For animal food with a hazard requiring a preventive control, you must establish a written recall plan for the animal food and assign responsibility for performing all procedures in the recall plan. So you have to write it down and you have to designate who is going to do what. The written recall plan must include procedures that describe the steps to perform the following actions as appropriate to the facility. Number one, directly notify consignees about the animal food being recalled, including how to return or dispose of the affected animal food. Number two, notify the public about any hazard presented by the animal food when appropriate to protect human and animal health. Number three, conduct effectiveness checks to verify the recall has been carried out. And number four, appropriately dispose of recalled animal food, for example, through reprocessing, reworking, diverting to another use that would not present a safety concern, or destroying the animal food. This slide is the only slide in this whole chapter that has any regulatory text on it, and this is all of the regulation on the recall plan. So have a plan, write it down, designate who's going to do it, and make sure you've got these four components built into that plan. There are three different classes of recalls, Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3. And Class 1 is going to be associated with the most severe of hazards. Those are SOCOTA hazards. If you're dealing with a SOCOTA hazard, you're definitely going to be doing a Class 1 recall. You are only required to file a reportable food registry, an RFR, if you are doing a Class 1 recall. And the FDA may help you decide which of these categories that you fall under, but these are some just quick descriptions of each of those different categories. If the FDA doesn't agree with which category you think you'll be in, they will let you know that. We had one case in Oregon not too long ago, earlier in 2017, where a company issued a Class 3 recall, thought they were in a Class 3 recall, but they did go ahead and issue an RFR because they didn't know the difference in that, in those requirements. So once that RFR came across FDA's theoretical desk, they took a look at that case and said, oh, no, we are dealing with Class 1 recall here. We're going to have to go through a lot more steps to rectify this problem. So anyways, those are our 3 different categories of recalls. Sometimes the FDA will request that a company do this on their own initiative, and that's totally fine. A firm can choose to do any of these recalls through their own initiative. I think it looks a little bit better to the public if it says that so-and-so is voluntarily recalling product A, B, and C because of problem B, as opposed to the FDA mandating a recall on those products. Here is a quick description of some of the recall plan requirements, which I think come out of that regulation that we just read a few minutes ago. Again, this is required for any food that is deemed requiring a preventive control, or a hazard requiring a preventive control. It does need to be written down, and it has to describe really specific steps and assign responsibility for who is going to notify direct customers and consignees, who's going to notify the public when that's appropriate, who's going to conduct effectiveness checks and how do we do that, and how do we execute the disposition of food, and how do we make those decisions. Here are some common elements of a recall plan, and I think we see a lot of these in the example recall plan that's in the back of the student manual. We have defined roles and responsibilities. Everyone knows what their job is and what it looks like to carry out that job. We also probably want to have backups for each of those roles, and those people need to know that they're backups and what those responsibilities are. You have a contact list for external notification, which is going to include regulators, customers, and the public. Maybe some media outlets as well should be on that list. When we say regulators, we're really trying to stress to people that to not just contact your district-wide FDA recall coordinator, but also your state, contact, your state regulator and feed inspector, so that they are aware of the issue and can help other companies recall any of those foods or help you recall those foods, because they are the ones that are constantly in the retail facilities taking samples. So they can help those retail facilities make sure to get that recalled product off the shelf. So make sure that list is comprehensive. Also make sure that those contacts are updated regularly so that you actually are calling the right person when you need to. Lot identification and verification information. So anytime that we have to recall product, as close as we can get to those lots that are identified or the product itself, that's going to be important. Effectiveness checks. What does it actually look like to do an effective recall, and how can we measure that? What are some elements we can use to measure how well our recall went? And product disposition procedures. I think this is one of those things that can be left up to the case-by-case decision a little bit more, but perhaps in your company you want to have an agreed upon procedure for how those conversations go to decide what the appropriate procedure is for disposing of any given recalled product. So now we're going to go through each of those common elements and talk about them in a little bit more detail. So when it comes to defining roles, this is just kind of a quick list of some roles that may be used on a recall team. Recall coordinator, of course, who is actually in charge when that recall happens. This should be somebody that can be immediately available in the case of this emergency. Your PCQI, they're essentially in charge of your food safety system, right? So they should definitely be on that team. Operations manager, public relations, marketing, logistics, and receiving. That's an important one. We're asking for all of this product to come back to our facilities. So we need to have a plan in place and notify our people so that they can make sure that they know they need to set that aside and, store it appropriately as the rest of the decisions are being made about what to do with it. Quality assurance, your accountant. A lot of times recalls are going to be pretty financially detrimental. So having your accountant in place or having your accountant on this team to make sure that they have the appropriate resources to keep the company afloat during this whole process is really important. A scientific advisor, if you have access to one, that would be good to have on the recall team. They can help make decisions about what to do with this recalled product. Your attorney. Yes, there may be some lawsuits involved. Administrative support, your FDA recall coordinator and state recall coordinator, those are both people that I mentioned before. They should definitely be on your recall teams and be getting a phone call when you have to start this process. Each of these roles does need to be clearly defined, and it does need to be identified of who is each of these people. Once we've decided who is going to be on the recall team, we also need to make sure we have detailed steps written down so we know what this recall process looks like, who's responsible for it, and make sure we cover all our bases and do all of these things when a recall is taking place. So first of all, defining details about making sure we're documenting the scope of the recall. So how much product are we actually dealing with? And how far was it distributed? Regulatory agency communication, who's in charge of contacting those regulators, who actually makes that phone call? Who's in charge of actually initiating the recall itself? Customer notification, who's going to take charge of that, and what does that look like? How do we do that? What's our system? Information and data compilation, so that could be things related to the effectiveness or how much product do you get back, those types of things. Who's actually going to be compiling all that data? Document gathering, securing the inventory or affected lots in your control, so that was kind of like what I was saying about the logistics people being involved. Product disposition, who is actually making that decision, and then who's actually going to have to carry that out. And then documentation as well, who's responsible for writing all of these things down and keeping track of all of these things. Here are some examples of some external notification that should be happening when you go through this recall process. Regulatory agencies, of course, the FDA, your district FDA recall coordinator, your state recall coordinator or state feed inspectors should definitely be notified. Contact customers that are affected by the recall, and I think it's helpful especially to identify, well, of course we need to identify the product, but also including information about how to return it or how to dispose of it, and letting you know if they did dispose of it. I've also heard it recommended to just keep a picture of every product, of the label, of the outside packaging of every product that you sell on hand, so that if and when you do have to initiate a recall, you can circulate those pictures to both your customers and then also the public. So that's really easy for a media outlet to use, and it'll be much more likely to get your product back than just issuing lot code notifications. And then, of course, notifying the public is kind of along the same vein. This is required for Class 1 recalls, but may also be, you may ask to do this if you're dealing with a Class 2 recall as well. So one of the biggest reasons that we identify and track and use lot codes for our products is so that if and when there is a problem, we can identify anything that was actually affected to get it involved in this recall process. So this identification, this idea of identification might look a little bit different depending on the product that we're dealing with, but it could be things like the outer packaging itself. Could be feed tags on the bag or on a bin. With bulk shipments, it might be not directly attached to the product, but maybe the transportation service has the documentation with them. So that could be a way to identify that Railcar 7, 12, and 16 got this adulterated product. So make sure to identify and track those identifications throughout the process. You also want to identify the quantity of the product that was involved, because that's going to help you measure the effectiveness and figure out how well the recall went and how much of your product you were able to get back. When it comes to disposing of any recalled product, like I said, I think it should be a case-by-case decision, but sometimes there will be some obvious things that come out that, of course, this is the way that we're going to dispose of this product. Also, I think businesses tend to err on the side of how can we dispose of this product while still, maintaining some financial ground and not necessarily just destroying or incinerating all of this product that we get back. So things like relabeling or reworking are absolutely viable options, especially when we're just talking about like diverting to a different intended species. I think that's a viable option for sure. But it may come down to a case of where destruction is necessary, and that might look like a landfill, that might look like going to a landfill and actually documenting it being buried, or that might mean something like incineration. Regardless of what decision your food safety team comes to, you need to document that decision and justify it. You may also just want to have your regulators involved in this decision as well, and they may have some requests depending on the recall and the adulterated product. So just, make sure that you're communicating with those regulators and letting them know what you think the best decision is in this situation, in any given situation. There is a guidance document available about the diversion of animal foods on the FDA website. So that may be a good reference to have on hand so that when you're working through these decisions, you know what the FDA is going to ask of you. Effectiveness checks are a really great way to make sure that your recall plan is effective. So what this might look like, I think the most interesting way to do this, usually this is going to be a situation where we are measuring the amount of affected product that we actually get back to the facility. Okay, so this might look like number of bags recovered versus total number of bags shipped, or bulk product shipped versus bulk product recovered, or in storage. So this is a measure of like, I have sent a notice out there to get this product back. This is how much I sold of it, and this is how much I actually got back. But I think an interesting way to do this as well is to include a time factor. So like bags per day that were recovered, and that gives you just another element for you to analyze your recall plan and how well it worked. A few other things to consider with the idea of a recall. Number one, we've been saying this whole time through our discussions of food safety plans that we need to reanalyze every 3 years or as necessary. So a recall may be a situation where it raises the red flag that we need to reanalyze our food safety plan. And through that reanalysis, we may come to the conclusion that we need to modify our plan or modify one of our preventive controls. Or we could come to a decision that maybe it was an employee error, and so retraining will be necessary to make sure that the effectiveness of our preventive controls is enhanced, or some other actions may become apparent as you go through that reanalysis process. Through both that reanalysis process and through the entire recall, it's absolutely critical to maintain a log of your decision making for both the FDA, for future recalls, for future food safety teams, and for being able to reanalyze your food safety plan appropriately. After the recall is completed, it's definitely recommended to do a review meeting of what happened, why it happened, and how well that recall went. What was the actual effectiveness? What can we do better next time? And then, of course, we also want to periodically test the system. And what we mean by that is essentially conducting mock recalls. And most facilities that I've worked with do a mock recall annually. Nowhere does it say that you have to do mock recalls or that you have to do them annually. But it is definitely highly recommended to periodically test the system. So what that part of this is going to be verifying the information in the recall plan. So periodically testing the system means going through and making sure all of your contact information is correct. Do you have a procedure for the product dispositions? Do you have templates for any of the letters or notifications that you're going to send out? Updated customer lists and supplier lists, those are definitely important aspects as well. And then when conducting a mock recall, you are essentially testing the recall team to see if they can carry out the recall as designed. So some of the things that you can ask are, can they determine if a recall would be needed? Are the right people on the team, and are there alternates? Do they know how to contact technical help if needed? Can they trace product one step forward and one step back? And can they create records, logs, product dispositions, press releases, etc., any other documentation? Okay, I've heard some good stories of using the mock recall system in a variety of ways. So we can test this by getting a recall that was issued from a supplier or a recall that was issued from a customer and working the system both ways on those end of things. I've also heard this used as of like just asking your all of the alternates to do this at one point. So making sure they know that they are the alternates and then can carry out those duties. I think that's something that doesn't often get used because we kind of just rely on our main recall team. But testing those alternates could be an important and interesting way to do it as well. In summation, we have a couple of different categories of recalls, and those can be issued for food safety concerns like Secota hazards or quality issues like we would see in a class 3 recall. Written recall procedures need to have directions or procedures for how you notify customers, how you notify the public when appropriate, how to conduct effectiveness checks, and identifying proper disposition of the product. Mock recalls are useful to verify the plan is current, and communication with FDA, state regulatory agencies, and customers is absolutely vital. Here's the exercise associated with Chapter 10. For this one, I will again incorporate this into one of your assignments, but at this point, I think it would be good to reflect on any experiences that you have with recall plans in the past. Does your current facility have a recall plan? If so, does it have all of those required components that we just went over? Have you ever had to use it? Do you guys conduct mock recalls, and what's your procedure for doing that? If you do not currently have a recall plan, how are you going to go about starting one? How are you going to approach this and tackle developing a recall plan? And then what approaches do you think would be effective for establishing metrics to evaluate the success of your recall plan given the nature of your facility? So to summarize that exercise, our last exercise, a recall plan is required for a hazard requiring a preventive control, but may be a good practice even for facilities that do not have those hazards. And the types of recall plans and their key metrics may vary based on the type of facility and type of animal food manufactured. Here is a slide that gives you some contact information for the FDA guidance documents or the FDA TAN network, Technical Assistance Network, and also some contacts for the FSPCA. So if you have any questions about any of this regulation, those are two really good resources for you. Remember, you also have access to the preamble that answers a lot of common questions and gives you some context for this regulation. I hope all of this chunk of the course was helpful for helping you understand the Part 507 of the Food Safety Modernization Act on current good manufacturing practices and preventive controls for animal food.